And introduce myself, I am Jerry Ilford, I am the Arable Advisor at the Soil Association. One of the projects the Soil Association is associated with is Innovative Farmers. Innovative Farmers supports farmer-led research from the ground up. So farmers come to us with ideas. You'll see on the chairs that you're sitting on some cards, the ideas cards. We use them to decide which direction we want to take the research projects we go on. These projects are from an organic, from a conventional, from a regen, from a holistic, from any point of view. The sort of projects we've done have ranged from feeding biochar to cows to find out if it has any effect on gut health, to playing music to chickens to find out if it affects yields, to terminating cover crops without using glyphosate, using rollers, to this particular trial, which is the one we're talking about today, which is the Living Mulches trial. The idea behind this, and I think everyone's very excited. I got someone I was talking to yesterday who I'd never met, suddenly got his camera out and started showing me, or his phone out, and started showing me the pictures of his own living mulch experiment. You know, he'd never met me before. He didn't, in fact, the first reaction when I said Soil Association was to step back 3 paces. But immediately into this conversation, absolutely brilliant that everyone is trying this and we need to find what's going on. The idea behind this trial is to investigate, we don't really know quite what, whether it can work, how it can be done, develop some ideas. There's a WhatsApp group where we chat, people are meeting. The conversations is less about what sort of drill you've got, what you've got. It is much more about how do I do it, what crops did I use, what varieties did I use. Everything else comes together. We've got a very, very good group of people here speaking, all involved in the trial in some way. But I'm going to let them introduce themselves as we go through. But as I said, this is farmer-led. The ideas come from farmers. One of the first people that talked to me about the possibility of doing this is Clive Bailey. Clive is here, so that's Clive. Why are you interested, what you want to do, where we go from there?
Okay, yeah, so my name's Clive Bailey. I farm near Lichfield in Staffordshire. We're a kind of fairly large-scale arable combinable crop farm, no livestock, and we've been down that kind of regen ag, no-till route since 2007, 2008. So for me, this seemed like the next logical step. We've cut out certain groups of inputs like insecticides completely, and obviously are dependent on synthetic nitrogen in a conventional kind of situation. Has always felt that a little bit unsustainable to me. So the idea of, and without any livestock in the system, organic seems a difficult thing to make work, because I've not got that fertility within my system. So I wanted to find ways to be that little less dependent on the bag of synthetic nitrogen. So growing some of my own between the crops seemed to make a lot of sense. And the idea of a living mulch, and my original kind of idea was that we could maybe mow into row on wider row spacing between cereals, seemed to make a lot of sense there. Also, I think if we look abroad to the countries, I travelled a bit in Denmark a year or two ago, where they're quite restricted on nitrogen use. So I can see that potentially the legislation may go that same kind of way in the UK. So at that point, we know that nitrogen is such a the best return on our money in a conventional farming situation. So if I end up restricted on it, I'm going to lose yield if I don't find other sources. So I've gone into this very much with no preconceptions, no ideas as to how it might work. It's very much a kind of learning from others. And actually, one of the things that's come out so far is a lot of people were already doing this in different ways, and by kind of make the trial that's been created by Innovative Farmers has kind of brought a lot of those people out saying, I've been doing that, and this works and this doesn't. So we're all learning from each other with it. There's been success and failure along the road, but that's why I got involved, I guess.
Okay, brilliant. As I said, we developed a group of people who had an interest in this, and Mark, who's the next one we're going to talk to, was actually at a meeting elsewhere that day, had to come back in, was quite unconvinced about the possibilities, but somehow during the course of the afternoon he became convinced it might be worth a look. He probably remains the least convinced member of or was the least convinced member of the group. But Mark, your comments and your experience, please.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, my motivation is quite different from Clive's. We're organic and have been for 20 years plus. So we're coming from the completely different angle. I was pessimistic about this trial. I think I was more excited about this trial than anything else we've ever tried. but perhaps more pessimistic about it. I'm not pessimistic anymore. We'll get to the positive bits hopefully later on. As I say, because we're organic, weed control is our big issue, and cultivation is our other big issue. We are one of the many organic farmers who are uncomfortable about how much we plough, how much we cultivate, but we feel trapped in it. I felt trapped in it for weed control. We couldn't do direct drilling without some other way of coping with our weeds, and the mulch appeared to show the benefit, or show the possibility of being the answer. The familiarity we have was with undersowing and with clover, because we do it all the time, so that side of this idea didn't worry me at all. The direct drilling, of course, is completely new, but we are thoroughly enjoying this. It's been a really interesting trial that is at a really interesting point now. I'm really quite excited about what harvest will show us, so I'll tell you about that.
The other thing that we do with innovative farmers, okay, we get groups of farmers together. Farmers are really good at getting together and talking and talking and talking and talking. And we need to make sure that the trials that we run are done properly and have some sort of scientific rigour, because otherwise they're just meaningless. Now, I, having been a farmer in the past, I remember years ago growing 5 different varieties of maize and planting them in different sections, and then I couldn't remember where they were when it came to harvest. That's the sort of thing we as farmers do as farmer-led research. To do that, to make sure it works properly, we actually bring in a researcher, and the researcher's role is to do all that researchy stuff, to make sure it's done, to go and do soil samples, to do plant samples. So our researcher for this project is Dominic Amos. Dominic's from the Organic Research Centre, and if you just touch on the sort of things that we are testing and checking in this trial to make sure that we can learn something even if it doesn't work, because that's the important thing about research.
Thanks, Jerry. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I suppose I'll start with the motivations from my angle as well. So they're kind of twofold. One is the approach. So I very interested in supporting farmers-led research and their interests, and absolutely the motivation comes from from that end. But kind of on a journey together to learn and to research, and hopefully I'm adding some value to the trials and the interest of the farmers. Then in terms of the topic and the theme, I think it's absolutely fascinating. It's been a real pleasure to visit the farms and work with Mark and Clyde and others on it. Watching the progress of the crops direct drilled into a established clover stand this season, the monitoring that we're doing, a way to kind of integrate fertility building lay within the cash cropping cycle, a way to bring ecosystem services in, but also then with all these trade-offs to try and avoid too much loss in productivity. So the trials, they've always got control of standard farm practice, so conventionally tilled and drills. Then obviously we're testing this living mulch, so we've selected a species mixture of wild white clover and medium leaf clover. Actually, one of the interesting things already is that the medium leaf white clover is kind of dominated. The micro clover have been chosen to offer enough suppression of weeds, but without offering too much competition for the cereal crop. But we've actually got the medium leaf clover. There's a lot more biomass. There's a lot more competition from that. So that's already something quite interesting. It's not quite controlling perennial weeds and grasses, which is what we kind of feared. The rye looks like it's been impacted more severely than the oats. The oats look like a better match in terms of direct drilling straight into the clover. We've been monitoring the yield components, which are a really useful thing to kind of tell you when the competition's occurred, and when you might need to manage the clover to avoid too much productivity loss. So obviously tiller numbers, that's decided quite early on in the season. Spikelet numbers, we've noticed in the rye that the ears are shorter, there are less spikelets. We know that spikelet numbers determined before growth stage 30. And then already we see less panicles on the oats, less spikelet numbers. So we know that competition early between the clover and the cereal is quite important, and kind of points to trying to limit the biomass, reduce the competition of clover, maybe over the winter, possibly with grazing sheep, possibly by mowing. But yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating, and yeah, a real pleasure working with the farmers to support their research.
Okay, so we mentioned 2 issues in those comments that we've discovered already. So the one specific starting point is management of the mulch in order to maximise yield, because obviously we do know that even what's a weed? A weed is a plant growing when you don't want it, but we tend to worry about them as competitors. Clover can be a competitor. So Mark, with livestock on your farm, your management, what should you have done, what did you do, what do you think we're going to do in future?
What we did do, we established our undersown clover, it's pure white clover, in May 20. So it was undersown into two crops two fields on our farm, one with spring wheat and one with winter wheat. The spring wheat undersow did quite well. Of course, last summer was a drought summer, in April, May and into June. I think we were lucky in that our clover didn't germinate until the rain in June, so we ended up with a really good undersow take last year, which we may not have had. But we ended up with good clover cover under the spring wheat, as you'd expect. Spring wheat's our thinnest crop, and a less good clover cover under the winter wheats, which were heritage wheats, so they were pretty big and difficult for it. We topped up the cover under the winter wheat after the combine, but only with a little bit extra seed, and grazed both with sheep hard in October. So we took it, I was intending to take it right down, absolutely, to the ground if we could. It was very wet when we were grazing, so I had to get them off because I felt the feet were damaging the young clover a little bit. But it was pretty short when we direct drilled late October. We used two drills on our trial. We used I know it's not a direct drill, but we used a Horsch Pronto just with the discs, just with the drilling disc down, and we had a Simtech demo as well on the day. The disc drill struggled for penetration a little bit, which I guess is not a surprise. The Simtech was very happy into that turf, if you like, although it's just pure clover, no grass, obviously. Both emerged well. Simtech a little slower, but I think it caught up over the winter. That really, I think, where Jerry's just led into the possibility that next year, because we are going forward with this, we will graze sheep on the crop itself, and graze the cereal and the clover at the same time in the winter. I didn't feel the clover was particularly a problem to either of the crops in early spring, but they were perhaps it was. I think clover is clearly a competitor for the crops. I've spent the last 20 years trying to control weeds because they compete, and now I've sown one. So we're obviously creating competition for the crop, and yield penalty was and remains one of the biggest worries, if not the biggest worry, obviously, with the whole concept. But both crops got away well. As Dom said, the rye got away earlier, as you'd expect. I picked rye and oats thinking those were the two real strong powerhouses of crops that we could grow that would compete best. And the rye, bizarrely, I think was almost too vigorous in that it tried to grow really fast early on, and it competed with the clover then. There wasn't nitrogen available. The clover itself was using the nitrogen, we think, then. So that maybe affected its growth, and the rye is now about a foot shorter than the control. The control is taller than me, the control, but the mulched rye is about 5 foot tall and the control about 6. There's clearly going to be a yield penalty on that. Oats much less so, which I can come on to.
Yeah. Okay. So, and Clive, different problems you had, but also different thoughts in terms of the management.
Yeah, so really, I'm a year behind now because our first year was, well, there's no way to put it, a complete failure. We established the clover into winter wheat in the spring, and basically just after we established it, it didn't rain then for 90 days. So we just didn't get that establishment. It never came. Now we had conversations in the group at the time because one of the trial participants is half organic and half conventional. So we questioned. And
by that it means he's got one organic farm and one conventional farm. You can't be half organic.
But his establishment on the organic acreage was fine. On the conventional, he had suffered the same fate as we did, where it just didn't get established with the dry weather. So we had discussions about, is it actually with the residual chemicals, things like that, to blame potentially. But I think ultimately we've kind of landed on it, just the soil type, the lighter soil types for a very droughty time. Clover clearly needs good moisture to get going. So, but we tried. We've gone again this autumn, this spring, and established into winter wheat and into winter barley. The weed issue is less of an issue for us, I think, than it is Mark. Over a decade of low disturbance, no-till kind of practices, means we've really kind of run down the kind of seed bank in our top kind of couple of inches of soil. So we have a lot less weed pressure anyway, and we're really on top of grassweed issues and that kind of thing now. So I'm coming at it less from the weed control, but I guess this is the downside of the cultivation that's needed in Mark's system compared to ours, I guess, and germinating more weeds to that competition. So, but anyway, this year it's established fine. We got rain and it's established, and we're heading towards that kind of first harvest there. I don't expect to really learn a lot this season because clover's still at that size where it's not really competed with the wheat or the barley that it's undersown with at this stage. I think this is a kind of a thing where second year, which is where Mark was, is where it actually starts to get interesting. That year one is all about really just getting the clover to establish and take it forward. For me, sheep aren't an option that we always have, although we do sometimes have B&B grazing sheep in that we may use potentially within the trial if I've got some this year. But probably we're more likely to take a more mechanical approach of mowing to kind of knock back the clover at establishment, or even I have the luxury we can use kind of lower rates of glyphosate. Clover's an easy plant to chemically check, but it's hard to kill. So I think actually when we're using kind of some of our synthetic inputs, our herbicides can be used to hold it back. But ultimately, I'm thinking I'm really quite keen on the mowing idea, the inter-row mowing particularly. However, the technology doesn't really seem to exist in the UK. It seems more common in America. When Jerry put some quite interesting on Twitter yesterday of a machine working on slightly wider rows than we are, but the 25 centimetre spacing is plenty wide enough to inter-row hoe, and I kind of think if we can inter-row hoe, we can inter-row mow. It's not that different.
Yeah, visions of lots of little fly mows being joined together on a boom and going across the field. But actually, is that such a silly vision? Who knows? One of the Clive's just mentioned there that as a non-organic farmer, he has a lot more tools in his box. One of the ones that we do know you have in the box is nitrogen, funny enough, as a control for clover. So, Dom, any comments on that role in this?
Yeah, well, as you say, I mean, obviously from an organic viewpoint, from a conventional no-till viewpoint, you've got different tools in the armoury. So, absolutely, the systems for conventional no-till would be about suppressing the clover, the mulch, whatever you're growing in the spring, and you can do that with both nitrogen or a kind of dilute application of herbicide. Which would be the best way to kind of limit competition and reduce any sort of yield penalty. So it's not just that it sort of suppresses the clover, but more that it hands a competitive advantage back to the cereal. So yeah, that would be the approach there. But I would say about the row spacings and a few other things. These systems, there's a lot of work going on in the States, and there's a kind of proposal to regenerate the soils and the damage that they've done from this very intensive maize and soybean cropping. And they're looking at, obviously much wider row spacings and looking at even introducing kind of prairie grasses back to the farming systems on quite wide row spacing. So even things like meadow grass or bent grass or fescues to try and just restore again some of those ecosystem services because of all the damage they've done from such intensive agriculture.
Okay, so you mentioned nodulation coming into the session. So obviously some very exciting news from the trial. One of the questions we've got, and one of the issues that we need to think about, is how can we release the nitrogen that's there in the crop, in the clover, to make it available. Now, we sort of understand that clovers will only release it when they're damaged. We've talked about the possibility. But actually, if we got it happening, is this something are we actually producing nitrogen? That's the question.
Well, I thought we've got to try and find something interesting to say today. So I went out yesterday. We've watched our crops without really, or I have anyway. We've been watching the crops with interest. As I said, the rye appeared to be more affected. It was as if the clover was starving the rye of nitrogen, but in an adjacent field, it was as if the clover was feeding the oats. So the two crops behaved very differently. The oats extended later, and particularly late this year being so cold. But the oats on the mulch side have looked darker and greener and healthier than the control, which look absolutely fine. The opposite of the rye, and that's been bugging me all along. Why could that be? And we've worked out possible theories for that. But yesterday I did go and dig up some of the clover, and we found under the rye there was only a few very, very tiny nodules on the clover roots under the rye, which, as I say, is 5 foot tall, so it's dark down there. There's no light particularly down on the clover. It's been heavily competed with by the rye. The oats are much shorter. It's a short year for oats, so they're only about waist high, a bit less than that even. And there is plenty of light still on the clover. The clover under the oats has got more nodules on it, and they are bigger. So whether there is something there that the clover is happier, it is being less heavily competed with by the oats than it is by the rye. The third plant site I dug up, I went in a grazing lay, which is close by, which was sown May 20 as well, which has been grazed with sheep, and the nodules are much, much bigger under the grazing lay, which has been cut and grazed this year. So it would appear to confirm what we've all known really, that the mechanical damage or grazing damage will stimulate nodules, where perhaps crop competition will actually suppress them. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly right, Mark. Yeah, so I think the dynamics of the clover and the cereal crop are the really interesting thing, and actually, I mean, nitrogen fixation is quite an energy-intensive process. If the clover is under a lot of stress, as the cereal's competing for light and resources, moisture, nutrients, and it starts to grow up and into stem extension, then the clover is very likely to stop fixing nitrogen and actually puts all its energy into growth, from that perceived threat from the cereal. So, and that sounds exactly, like what's happened there on your trials. And the other thing from the flip side on the crop's response to the clover and that's perceived threat. So actually, even if it's not being shaded out, it responds to differences in the kind of wavelengths of light because the clover is absorbing a lot of the light. The kind of far red ratio changes, and it will change its growth in response to that as well. So the cereal will have apical dominance, so it will grow up, it will elongate, it will till it less, again because it's kind of a perceived threat from the competition. So there are these sort of built-in trade-offs around growing those two crops together, but it's fascinating watching them grow together and the dynamics and thinking about how best to manage the system. And I guess that's the big question now, is to optimize it and start developing how best to make it work, which is obviously where trials like this are so brilliant and really worthwhile.
Okay, we want to open up a bit more now. Can we just have a quick show of hands? Those people who have in the past attempted, either accidentally or deliberately, to grow an understory of clover in your crops. So a good percentage of the people in this room, which actually demonstrates what we're thinking, is this is something everyone has been secretly dabbling away with doing or trying. Has anyone tried any cover crops other than, or living mulch type crop, other than clovers? Because one of the questions, what are you going? Okay, so other cloves, other herbs and stuff, and actually it's interesting because when we look at it from the point of view of people who don't use from an organic viewpoint, we often see those herbs, those weeds, as providing an awful lot more into the biodiversity of the thing, so slow growing. I'm just going to throw in an angle on this, is that one of the issues we're looking at is obviously weed control. We also have the issue of getting the germinations, and a conversation with some European partners in a project we're on. They're actually looking at using something like cress as, and we all think of cress as that stuff we grew at school in cotton wool, but cress is an annual plant. So if you have it and it germinates in the spring underneath the understory, it will then go through its life cycle into the autumn, flower, seed, and die. And it won't germinate in the winter because it's too cold. So you grow your crop, and then the seed is sat there in the ground, and we know that as organic farmers, white clover is actually a bit of a weed in our system because it just germinates naturally when it's actually been organic for a period of time. So maybe we can look at actually cover crops that grow throughout the year or just appear at the time of year we want them and then go again. Anybody doing anyone who, having listened to all this, is actually intending to go for living mulches and wants to be part of the trial for starters or be part of the group will be good. But brilliant people here in the front. Anyone got any other things to add to what we've been saying about the management, the control, the reasons you think it failed? We just sort of quite get more interactive now if we can. It'd be difficult without the microphones, but we can sort of shout and I'll repeat the questions, I think. So, yeah.
Just quickly, what, like you said about at the beginning, you're aiming to reduce the bag fertiliser use, obviously for nitrogen. This will be in the year 2. What crop are you planning to have in year 2? And what percentage are you hoping? What's the kind of target for dropping back on bag nitrogen and clover?
I think to start with, we'll probably try and split it and run part of the trial with a reduced rate of nitrogen and part of with the same, and see if we suffer a yield loss as a result of that. It's not just about, I mean, I perhaps emphasise the nitrogen side of things too greatly. It's partly about the changes to my farming system. I think one of the big reasons that it's been, you know, generally successful has been increasing the diversity in our rotation, both in the cash crops we grow and through cover cropping and companion cropping, you know, outside of this trial. So, by growing the clover, to my mind, is going to be more than just about nitrogen. I perhaps kind of, you know, we've perhaps been focused a bit too much on that. It's also kind of adding some diversity in a monoculture of wheat, which is not the most, you know, ecologically or from a soil health point of view, it's a bit of a desert. So if I can kind of almost, I'm kind of seeing it partly as cover crops have done us a lot of good. If I can, but have grown them between cash crops. This is almost, if I can grow cover crops with my cash crops as well, that's got to surely be a good thing, not just for nitrogen, just for all the other nutrition that the soil biology, if we can, whatever we can do to enhance soil biology, should bring more access to that mineral nutrition. So it's not just nitrogen, I guess, it's overall soil health and therefore plant health and therefore yield.
Mark, organic rotations. Well, in fact, rotations as a whole. If this, and if we can get this to work, if we get these cover crops to be persistent to survive, where are rotations, and I'll come back to you, Clive, on this in a second, where are the rotations going to go as a consequence?
I have no idea. I really don't. We've been organic for a long time, and we've followed a similar rotation that whole time, and it's a rotation that I got out of an organic textbook 21 years ago, and it works, but it involves a fertility building phase. For us, it's only a 1 year or an 18-month clover lay that does it, but every organic farmer really has fertility building in their rotation. They sow generally their most exhaustive crops first, wheat, and follow up with oats and things later in the rotation when there's less nutrition. This is changing, potentially changing that round completely for us. We're looking at establishing the clover. I think most people who have tried it will agree that the best undersowing establishment is in the spring cereal or in spring crop. So we may well start with a spring oat maybe as a first cereal and follow that with a direct drilled winter wheat as a second cereal, a complete reverse on where we used to be. If we can direct drill one crop, that will be great. The other disadvantage, there are only two disadvantages I think to us. Yield penalty, which we don't yet know, is the one. Perennial weeds is our other worry, that we've clearly got more perennial ryegrass, you see on one of my photos up there, and docks and thistles in the mulched area, simply because we haven't cultivated to control them. So that's clearly going to be a burden a problem we have to address. How long we can keep our mulch going will be affected by that. So we may be able to direct drill again, or we may have to take it out and start again. But even if we can do that, even if we can have 2-year bursts, so undersow in one crop, direct drill the next, we can reduce our ploughing and cultivation down to maybe 40% of the farm year. At a minimum, which would be a fantastic step forward for us. But I think the perennial weed burden is likely to mean that we have to continue to cultivate somewhere in that rotation, maybe once or twice.
Yeah, so the rotation side of it is a kind of concern from what we're learning so far, where in Mark's case, where it's working, you know, well in one crop in the oats, but not so well in the rye. And obviously with it being a plant that's going to go through the rotation, I can kind of contradict myself here a little bit, because I do wonder, I mentioned diversity as being so important to us, and diversity through the cash cropping, for a wider rotation, more variety in the cash crops that we're growing, and the cover crops between them. But something else we've got going on in the farm is we've got a continuous wheat trial running, which completely contradicts my thinking on diversity, where we're growing like a very short term, like a quick cheap cover crop between the wheat. And we've found there that that field's in year 6 now, this continuous wheat, and we've seen no yield penalty that we'd normally have had from second or even third wheats with take-all. It's kind of like the diversity of the cover crop breaks the cycle. It's like a a non-cash crop break. So actually, is the potential within this, is one of the questions I've got in my head, that could this be a key where we can grow a continuous wheat crop, for instance, but because we've got the clover understory in there, actually we've still got the diversity that we'd have through a big wide diverse rotation. But that would let me, if that worked, I mean obviously the more wheat we can grow, the better our overall rotational gross margin is. So if it maybe opened the window to growing more wheat and less of the less profitable break crops, that would be beneficial from that perspective as well.
What about other break crops? So a lot of people have been sowing clovers in as companion crops with obviously rape to try and break up that flea beetle issue. And also traditionally, clovers have often been grown underneath in beans. So is there something else that we think would fit into this living mulch rotational strategy?
I mean, I guess there is, yeah. I think we're looking to keep it simple if we can. Spring oats are a very good crop for us and we can sell them very well. So what it potentially does for us, and that's perhaps not the wrong thing to say to that question, but it perhaps removes so much need for us to have a non-cereal break crop. Because we will have a continuous non-cereal crop in our ground with some substantial periods where there's no cereal present there at all. We may not even need a fertility building break in future with all this clover that we've got. I really don't know how this could change the basic concept of organic rotation sustainability in a really exciting way. But we're going to need to continue, obviously, to control those perennials, and we're going to have to continue to alternate spring and winter crops to disrupt the life cycle of weeds. But we've controlled, one of our main reasons for doing this was to get on top of the crazy annual recycling of particularly charlock seeds in our system, where we're just ploughing them down, bringing them up year after year, and we've obviously virtually eliminated that from these direct drill crops in 1 year, which is a massive positive for us. So I don't know where it leaves the non-cereal breaks, but who knows? I think anything is possible from what we've seen so far.
So Dominic, on the trials so far, one of the things you've been looking at is plant diversity within the plots. What effect has the cover crops been having actually on the weed populations that you're finding? Obviously perennials have been mentioned, but we know that's a problem in organic anyway. So
yeah, well, of the 3 trials that have been set up, yeah, absolutely, the abundance of perennial weeds, docks, thistles has absolutely increased. Grass weeds, Mark's ryegrass and cocksfoot. So yeah, that is a problem. I think, as Mark says, you could still break cycles. It doesn't have to be impermanently. So maybe it's keeping a diversity of approaches to help with your weed control. Maybe one interesting thing as well, from Mark's perspective, he's talking about integrating the fertility building lay. Even those in-year yield penalties could be offset by increased cash cropping if you're able to, essentially grow your lay at the same time as you're doing your cash crops. Clyde's point about the kind of suppressive soils and continuous wheat, yeah, so that's that's all a research concept, and things like take-all after 3-4 years start to reduce as the soils start inoculating themselves against those kind of diseases. Some even more extreme examples of no-till and continuous cropping and living mulches. I mean, I know certainly of one farmer who's doing a kind of continuous grain cropping where he just crops a diverse population of heritage wheat over and over again. And the diverse weed community kind of controls itself. He'll top that up with an understory of clover as well, but keeping that system going. And even heard more recently of kind of pasture cropping, where a group are direct drilling straight into their grass, herbal lays. Again, with kind of heritage crops, heritage wheats, or diverse populations. So there are options and flexibility, I think, and I think that living mulches give you that. One other thing I'd add, obviously they're alternative systems. Sometimes technology takes time to catch up. and the infrastructure, and we already talked about the lack of maybe appropriate machinery. Breeding, I think, is another thing that needs to be talked about, because crops aren't bred to perform or grow in these systems, but potentially maybe with some breeding to look at crops that are adapted, cereal crops that are adapted to growing together with clovers and mulches, or even the breeding of the actual, the mulch species and cultivars themselves that offer less competition or have the traits that more complementary to the cereal crop is also somewhere else this could go to in the future.
Okay, it's moving away into a slightly different direction. Pasture cropping you mentioned, and pasture cropping in many ways with people with livestock. This is a direction we maybe are heading, is so that I talked yesterday to I can never remember his surname, so Regen Ben. He's been doing this pasture cropping for he's been doing it under an undersown living mulch for 5 years, and seen no particular reduction in yield. He's not organic, so therefore he's quite happy with the yield he's getting. But what he also said, he gets a massive crop of clover within 2 weeks of harvest, and then he fats his lambs on it. And an absolutely amazing way of bringing in an alternative enterprise, a different source of income. So we look at the cereal field as a source of income once a year. So has anyone here been considering a pasture cropping type route? And I know this is an Australian system, particularly because of the climate. So can you?
Yeah, exactly. My original question was just as well. From experience, I've always been keen to have a bit of cereal crops that you've established on the other side. It'd be interesting to look at and what they get. The lower seed rates you get, the higher seed rates, at the end of the day, that crop I'm trying to sell in my eyes, it's always been a bit of crop to establish the undersown. My trials at the moment are undersown living clover with two small leaf clover coming down the wood. They're undersown growing. From on harvest from there, I'll then grow private real forest on the bench, which then will graze. So it's a series of cycles, it's a series of trials. We're certainly looking at it. But that comes under the OFG status, but also the PFRA. So again, covered by all the work, but certainly trials. Again, if it's not working on cattle, I think we're in machine.
Yeah. Yeah, so it would be fine under Soil Association standards as well, to be honest, just to make that plain. But is this a direction we ought to be looking at? We're talking about bringing livestock into arable rotations. I come from the southwest, you may possibly recognise from my accent, I come from Devon. Mixed farming systems are the norm, but we're up here in a world where mixed farming systems are not the norm. Is this a possible direction that we can actually rapidly increase livestock production, giving a source of, and one of the, not to mention costs, at a meeting we had the other day, one of the issues talked about is the cost of getting a cover crop in. The loss of yield is maybe compromised by the fact that you're guaranteed to have grazing for your land. You're guaranteed your cover crop because it's all in there in the subsurface underneath, so there's no drilling cost, there's no seed costs, and you get a crop of livestock. Is that something that's going to be a value? Clive's not got the livestock, but would you actually consider, if you could permanently introducing a flock of sheep because it becomes an income stream?
Well, yeah, I mean, the other thing is timing as well. The moment, as soon as we take a crop off, we're instantly got a big race to get our cover crops established straight away because we're losing moisture the moment we've harvested the crop. So I guess with undersown crops, you've already got your cover crop there. So as soon as you take the wheat away, it sees the sunlight, and we're continuing to capture all that sunlight and water that builds the soil carbon and organic matter, which is key to all this, isn't it? We have had sheep. I'm in an area which is there's very little livestock farming really, and the biggest problem for me with that it's a knowledge gap. An arable farm, I know as much about heart surgery or brain surgery as I do about looking after animals. You wouldn't want to be looking after your sheep, they'd probably all die. So it's finding people. I think that the key to that is going to be cooperation between people with the relevant skills, and that's quite a difficult kind of marriage to create. Particularly the geography doesn't always fit. I'm sure there's plenty of people with that knowledge in other areas of the country, but for them, are the economics of them bringing sheep to my farm, does that work? We've grazed sheep in previous years on our mixed species cover crops, where we've had overwinter cover crops, had spring crops, and that relationship works quite well. We have to try and work with somebody who's buying cover crop wants maximum value from it. So what we don't want anyone ever doing is grazing like they do with stubble turnips down to bare soil. We're kind of quite tight on the, look, we'll charge you half and only want you to graze half, because we still want to maintain that green cover. So yeah, it's learning. I think matching those skills together is the biggest challenge there, more than the idea of, would I like, mixed farming for me? I'd love my farm to be a mixed farm, but I lack the livestock knowledge to do a good job of that, so I'd be foolish to try. I need to find somebody that can complement my arable knowledge with their livestock knowledge, and that would be a great arrangement, really. So I think it's possible, but we need almost some kind of dating agency, or Tinder for livestock and arable farmers or something, don't we?
Well, we do have sheep, and we will increase them. And as Clive just said, we've got something we haven't had before. We're going to have a fantastic crop of clover in August, when our lays are perhaps getting a bit tired and we're getting a little bit short of keep in August and September. We're going to have the perfect place to put sheep. Then, as well as into the winter, we're going to have an established clover lay, which is much stronger under their feet than a new sown cover crop would be, and we won't have to wait till January to graze it. So much better than an annual sown cover crop, without any doubt. And there is a value in that. We've costed this thing. Obviously our system is different from everyone else's system, and it's a system change, this is, so it's very difficult to just simply work it out. But from my scribbles, we can certainly live with half a tonne to the hectare yield penalty, in direct real income from other sources and money saved, as well as there's a long list that everybody in the tent is aware of non-costed benefits of this process. There's a couple of disadvantages, but there's loads of advantages. But we can live with the yield penalty. It doesn't worry me as long as it's not too dramatic.
One of the other things that have been talked about, and again it came up at our meeting the other day, and it's an issue we're noticing now, recommendations and advice for farmers in a blackgrass area particularly is later drilling. Compromises, we've now got climate change. In whatever form of climate change, we've got weather change, if you like, for those of you who are not so convinced. We have a change in weather. You get to the middle of October, suddenly there's this mass panic to get drilled because it rained yesterday. It might be dry for the next month. Is there an opportunity here to use the combination of living mulches, earlier drilled cereal crops, and grazing in a sort of a folding type system, as used to, again I come from the southwest, so Dorset farmers used to fold oats over winter. I know, Dominic, we've done, there's been trial work done on this and the yield penalty of grazing crops, and again with the oilseed rape, benefited farmers ran a series of trials on grazing oilseed rape to try and reduce the flea beetle damage. So is this again a consideration or option of bringing in extra enterprises?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned blackgrass, because that's the one grass weed actually the other trial at Litchfield Farm in Oxfordshire that is being controlled quite well by the living mulch, quite surprising. So there's a control strip of direct drilled, so in organic field direct drilled without mulch, and if you compare the blackgrass in that plot with the blackgrass actually where the clover's grown, the clover has really suppressed the blackgrass. It's hardly tilled. The plants are much shorter, so I think there's definitely something in the competition from the clover really being able to reduce blackgrass.
The thing I'd add to that is as well, if you are going to drill late, we found that drilling on the green is a much more weather safe kind of situation. We really saw that back in the really wet 2019 autumn. I think everyone had an absolutely terrible autumn establishment kind of time. And it was notable, we'd got about 65-70% of our farm had got we'd got like a good green cover in, well established by that kind of November window. We were able to drill all of that land, even with relatively big machinery. All of that got drilled in good time, the right side of Christmas. And then we ran out of soils where we'd got a cover crop. So where we'd got bare soil, that was the land, the area we didn't drill till February, March, when it dried up again. It was just notable how much safer it is to have a growing, the root network. It kind of carries the machinery to some extent. So I think it's a more weather pack. If you're going to drill late, it's safer on a green cover.
Any other questions from the floor? I started asking questions from the floor and then I got distracted by asking my own questions again. So if there's any other questions to anybody, or just comments and thoughts, gentlemen here. I'm not sure the way that the world is thinking, setting fire to stubble. Sorry, I'll repeat the question. The question is whether we could actually look at stubble burning back into the rotation as a means of control. Well, I'm not going to shoot you down. I think. I'm going to answer that briefly myself. I worked in Surrey when I was at university, and setting fire to large areas of straw and stubble was horrific to me as a dairy farmer from the southwest. This is a really important asset. But equally, adding to the point there, yes, it had a weed control effect, but we don't want to be burning stuff like that. We don't want to be burning. It's carbon, and the best source of we want to be bringing carbon back into our soils. We're growing cover crops to do that, and even just burning the stubble at least is putting something back in the soil.
So it's just a little before my time, really, that the stubble burning, but and I get why it had that role in weed control, but equally, we're carbon farmers. What we sell is carbon. Wheat is carbon. We just turn sunlight and water into a form that we can sell. So why we would ever burn carbon it makes no sense to me. That's my product. I want to capture as much of it as I possibly can. So yeah, I see why it was a thing, but I'm sure there must be better ways, basically. And environmentally, it's not going to happen now, is it? Politically, no. So.
Yeah, just very quickly to the organic tech. How do you control your clover if you want to get rid of how do you do it as an organic farmer?
I'll just repeat the question for those who didn't hear. As an organic farmer, do you get rid of your clover in a moon-till situation?
I don't know yet. I don't know. Perhaps we won't. Perhaps we'll never get rid of the ruddy stuff now. I don't know. It is, as Jerry said, we live with clover as a weed and live quite contentedly with it because it pays its way, obviously. Red and white clover do crop up, and that's fine. I don't know how. We will probably have. My feeling is that when we get to the end of our rotation, when we would go into a fertility building lay, we've already got the clover, so we will direct drill possibly ryegrass, possibly other things into. I may go for a grassless lay now, but into that to get a fertility building period, and that will almost certainly have to be ploughed down to destroy it. I can't see any other option there. It will also be an opportunity for us to apply organic material back and incorporate it at the same time. So I'm trying not to get carried away with this. That we can answer all our ploughing and cultivation in one go. We certainly can't do that. It's a reduction that I'm looking for, and I think that is genuinely available to us now with this approach. But yeah, getting rid of the clover at the end will almost certainly involve a lot of cultivation.
Talked to someone the other day, a conventional farmer, who said his objective was to try and move to glyphosate once every 7 years. And I think as an organic farmer, our objective is possibly to using the play once every 7 years. That's a really nice direction. We're all heading in the same direction, forced by lots of things, and some of it is just simply that understanding of the effect of what we're doing on the soil and the wanting to adapt our systems to be better.
Question for Clive, I think. How does your normal herbicides have an effect on your clover? We've got backlash problem, like others, and quite interesting living bush. But normal herbicides, what they do to your living bush?
So just the question is, effect of normal herbicides on the conventional system on the living mulch, the clovers in the living mulch, and effectively policy, I guess.
Yeah, so basically, I think most of the herbicides we're using will check the clover quite heavily, which we can use that to hold it back when we want to. So when we're wanting wheat or a cash crop to get away, we have that extra tool over the organic guys in this trial. Very little will actually completely kill it. It seems to be the case. So equally, you mentioned organically, if I wanted to get rid of it in the future, I've introduced another weed. I mean, we're always very careful with other cover crops, so they never go to seed. One of the farms we farm, contract farm, grew borage apparently 20 years ago, and it's grown borage every year since. So we never let cover crops seed for that reason. Whereas we are kind of purposely bringing a weed potentially into our system. I think probably enough glyphosate would kill it, and so but yeah, it's actually the herbicide effect is an extra tool we have available as conventional farmers that Mark doesn't.
John.
So, Clive, I just wondered what the effect of putting a herbicide on the clover does as far as releasing nitrogen from the clover. Do you bruise it? Is it the same as damaging it with a mower or livestock?
I think that's something that we should measure as part of the trial, and we've not quantified that, but it does. Everything seems to be pointing towards, to get the clover to release its nitrogen, it needs to be stressed mechanically, or by grazing, or possibly chemically. I think really that would be a really good thing to bring into trial, that we measured before and afters of what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, being knocked back, its response to that is actually to drop, as well as the nodules senescing and providing nitrogen, it also drops a lot of carbon, which boosts microbial activity, which mineralises nitrogen too, so the clover can come back again. So yeah, I guess in theory that would work with herbicide.
Okay, so using nitrogen to suppress the clover for effectively, what sort of rates, timings, do we have any idea? I guess is really what you're asking.
So I do work for the Organic Research Centre, so we don't tend to do that kind of research. Yeah, well, I mean, I said to you, the key competition obviously is early spring. So I think you could. I don't know what levels, if I'm honest, but I mean that's the timing certainly that you'd want to try and boost the cereal and knock back the clover.
We've so far just kept to our normal nitrogen timings as if we were growing it anyway, which obviously that does give us that very early spring when growth starts kicking off, kind of late February, early March. So it would, if it's having that suppression effect, then that's great, because that's when we want the cash crop to get away from it. So probably fits in with your normal kind of timings and rates anyway.
We know from grass mixtures, Italian ryegrass, red clover type mixtures, that you can get up to 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare from the clover in that mixture. We know that agronomists have a tendency to advise 30 kilograms of nitrogen at the beginning of the spring to make the grass grow quicker, and that mucks up the nodulation and reduces response. It's one of the easiest cop-outs for an agronomist. Oh, well, the clover didn't work, so you put, because it didn't nodulate, well, that's because you put nitrogen on to start with. So low rates of nitrogen we know depress that growth. And it may well be one of the tools that you as conventional farmers have, is to be able to use nitrogen as part of the system. We're acknowledging that's part of one of the things we want to try and develop. The knowledge from people who've tried stuff. We also know that an awful lot of people are still applying an awful lot more nitrogen than they actually need. And so this might be another way of reducing.
Well, that can I just say, I mean, that's where also the clover's, it's not just there to fix nitrogen, but it's also performing a catch crop function as well over the winter, and if there's extra nitrogen, then it's more efficient use of nitrogen to the system, even if you are still using mineral nitrogen.
Exactly, and I think we're tending to focus very heavily on talking about the nitrogen, but for my mind, having that constant living extra root biomass within the soil is actually kind of providing all that biology and fungi with kind of extra kind of ecosystem. So it should be right through all the trace elements, and everything should be more available theoretically because of that kind of healthier environment we're creating throughout the whole growing season, and never a situation where we've got a desert of a bare soil with no plant alive growing. There's always going to be something growing in that field.
We are assessing soil, and I'm using the soil health metrics within the inverted commas. We are looking at the soil properties and as part of the trial to look at measuring organic matters and nitrogen levels and stuff throughout. We'll get an idea of what happens as a consequence in comparing with control, which is being farmed by the farmer his normal way. Again, is part of the point behind field labs. They run their own farm. The lab just fits in the middle of it. Question there.
Apologies, stupid question, but in the conventional system apply, is there any worry that either of these effectively deliberately check over with
So just risk of resistance in the clover by constantly using the herbicides to reduce it effectively.
Yeah, I guess it's a risk over time, isn't it? I mean, I don't think the resistance issues that conventional has come across more tend to be more around the grass weeds than I'm not really aware of many resistant kind of broadleaf type like plants. It's nearly always grass weeds, isn't it? So I guess potentially it could be a problem, but ultimately, I think by the time that becomes a problem, will we have worked out how to not need those herbicides anyway? If going back to the inter-row mowing concept, I think with that kind of mulched ground cover, that if we were mowing relatively regularly, in the same way that people are using kind of inter-row hoeing to control their weeds in organic systems and even some conventional systems now, could we get to a situation where I don't need the herbicides anyway? Our herbicide use has reduced dramatically in the last decade or so with that change to no-till, because we've just brought that weed seed bank down, and through better rotation we're kind of really got on top of grassweed issues and things. So actually I'm heading towards a point where I still do need herbicides, particularly glyphosate in a no-till situation, but they don't feel as important as they once done already. So give me another 10 years and maybe they'll feel even less important. And so we've already cut out certain groups like insecticides. Fungicide use is almost created by the synthetic nitrogen we're using. So if we're not using so much synthetic nitrogen, will we need so much fungicide use? Ultimately, I guess what I'm getting to is, could you ultimately get towards that holy grail of like a no-till organic situation because of this? Could it develop into that, which is, I don't think, really possible at the moment without, as Jerry mentioned, strategic tillage, like 1 in 7 year or whatever ploughing. But I think we're learning and things are improving all the time. That 10 years from now, everything will have moved on another step, won't it?
Question at the very back.
Thank you. I just want to make 2 points very briefly, if I may. Firstly, you asked about the alternative species that you could use to white clover. In my experience, yellow trefoil is one of those species, but be very careful using yellow trefoil in a cereal rotation because it is quite aggressive, and it's clearly concerning really about having weeds coming back as a problem. Yellow trefoil will be great in a crop of sweet corn or something like that, where there's no competition in terms of height, but it's not a great option in terms of thinking about cereals. It can be very aggressive, particularly early in the spring, when you could be establishing cereals. The second point I'd like to make is, sorry.
Thank you. The second point I'd like to make very briefly, if I may, is that the white clover issue, as far as weed is concerned, I just don't get it. I think for me it's all about this living mulch. It's all about having continuous regeneration of that living mulch. And like any plant, some of these species, some white clover will die, but you can regenerate it with seed. And therefore, let it be a weed problem, because it's a pretty good one to have.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think weed was inverted commas.
I think, can I say, Jerry, as well, that's a pretty good point. So Cotswold Seeds have actually kind of sponsored the field lab too and supported the work and given their technical expertise to it. We're working with the HDB as well, and Organic Arable have also sponsored the field lab. So there's a lot of interest and support in this and working on these alternative systems, for more sustainable cropping systems.
Thanks for that, Dom. We have run out of time, which is amazing. I think we could have kept on talking for another couple of hours. Field labs. Guys, enjoy that. Where was I? I think we could have carried on talking for a lot longer. We're happy to carry on talking, and I think we're all around all day. So if you want to come to our Innovative Farmers stand, if you want to see me further on, if you have ideas, please fill out the Innovative Farmers things, and please go to see John Pawsey speaking in a couple of hours' time when he's talking about organic no-till, because John's a brilliant speaker. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.